Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of those fascinating research topics that touches on our digestive health, our overall well-being, and of course, what we eat. I think we'll be doing more of these health research breakdowns going forward because honestly, there's so much happening in the scientific world right now, and our job is to take all this news and figure out how to apply it to our own lives to stay healthy. So here's the thing. We have certain foods that are, let's say, controversial. They bring us joy, they make life a little sweeter, but there's always that nagging feeling, right? Like, is this actually bad for me? Take chocolate and coffee, for example. Some people are chocolate lovers, some are coffee addicts, and some of us, well, we love both. But a lot of folks, when they're enjoying their chocolate bar or sipping their morning brew, they're thinking, yeah, so this is probably a little bit bad for me, isn't it? There's always this ambivalence about it. But here's the thing, even doctors, gastroenterologists, cardiologists, primary care physicians, they're people too. Their lives aren't just work. In their regular lives, they eat chocolate and drink coffee just like everyone else. So let's figure this out once and for all. Is this stuff actually good for us or bad for us? Especially since there's been a ton of research on these topics. At this point, there's really no excuse for staying in the dark. So here's where it all started with chocolate. The whole story began with Norman Hollenberg, a Harvard researcher who was studying the Kuna people. They lived on the San Blas Islands off the coast of Panama. And get this, they ate a lot of salt, but paradoxically, they had low blood pressure. Now, we all know that if you eat a lot of salt, your blood pressure goes up, right? That's how you get hypertension and all sorts of other problems. But here's the twist. These indigenous people weren't just eating plain salt. They were eating salted cocoa beans. And throughout their entire lives, their blood pressure stayed right around 110/70, completely normal. This obviously fascinated researchers, and that's when all the scientific studies on this phenomenon kicked off. Turns out, when they analyzed the Kuna people's urine biochemically, they found high levels of nitric oxide derivatives. This was because they were stimulating nitric oxide synthesis through a flavonoid called epicatechin, which is found in abundance in those cocoa beans. But here's the crucial detail. When these indigenous people left their island and moved somewhere else, like to Panama City, this protective effect disappeared. From that point on, researchers started conducting tons of studies on chocolate and cocoa. After all, chocolate is made from cocoa beans, though there are some important nuances. Different amounts of milk get added, different amounts of cocoa, different amounts of sugar, and the cocoa beans themselves get dried and roasted in different ways. What they found was that dark, bitter chocolate does offer some protection against cardiovascular disease. It restores the inner surface of blood vessels. You know, that tube that your blood flows through has an inner lining called the endothelium, and these epicatechins actually improve that inner surface and enhance its function. They even specifically tested this by examining coronary arteries, the most critical arteries that feed your heart, using something called a cold pressor test to evaluate how these vessels actually work. And what they found was that yes, indeed, dark chocolate positively affects blood pressure, insulin resistance, and platelet function. You know, platelets are what cause blood clots to form. But these were small studies, and they needed to conduct a larger one to gather more evidence. Plus, there's this widespread belief that chocolate can also improve brain function. But there's a flip side to chocolate too. It still contains a lot of fat and a lot of sugar, and that means extra energy and extra calories that can increase body weight. So here's one of the more recent studies, and it's pretty interesting. Look, it would be great if all studies showed positive results, but sometimes you get negative findings. And here's the thing, nobody really talks about negative studies. Everyone's always like, this study found that such and such product does something amazing. You should eat more of it. But negative studies are important too because they help us figure out what specifically doesn't work. They save us from false expectations, wasted time, and wasted money on useless research and treatments. And this was probably one of those studies, the COCO study, Cocoa Supplement and Outcomes Assessment, which examined chocolate specifically. Sure, chocolate manufacturers have been pushing hard through marketing, telling us from every outlet that chocolate is healthy and we should eat more of it. But a proper randomized study of good quality hadn't really been done until recently. It just wrapped up not too long ago. And what they studied in the cocoa study wasn't exactly chocolate itself, but specifically cocoa extract, which had no added sugar and no added fat. So this isn't what you buy at the grocery store or the supermarket. This was specifically epicatechins in measured specific amounts. They studied different dosages. There was a 45 milligram dose, a 300 milligram dose, and a 900 milligram dose of these epicatechins. Just as a reminder of all foods out there, cocoa beans have the maximum concentration of these compounds. Cocoa beans contain somewhere between 1.5 milligrams per gram of product up to 2.8 milligrams per gram, so about 2 milligrams on average. In other words, the study was looking at truly maximal concentrations. They also included theobromine, which is found in cocoa beans, about 50 milligrams, and a small amount of caffeine. We'll touch on caffeine in a bit too. For the study, they selected relatively healthy people. Some had certain limitations or conditions, including heart-related ones, which actually makes the study more revealing because it shows how chocolate consumption affects the course of these diseases. And there were a lot of volunteers. Listen, everyone wanted to eat chocolate. Initially, they had almost 200,000 people who wanted to participate in this study, but after the selection process, about 22,000 remained. These 22,000 people were divided into different groups. Some got real chocolate, some got fake chocolate that had no actual cocoa beans in it. Plus, in each of these groups, some people got additional vitamins while others got vitamin placebos. So you had people eating chocolate with vitamins, people eating placebo chocolate with placebo vitamins, and there were two smaller groups to determine the exact effect of each component. One group got real chocolate but fake vitamins, and another group got fake chocolate but real vitamins. This way, they could test the effect of each component, and it was very interesting. They checked everything thoroughly and, of course, studied the cardiovascular system first and foremost. They evaluated whether eating chocolate had any impact on serious events. Heart attacks, strokes, deaths from cardiovascular disease, the need for stents in arteries, or whether it affected the blood vessels in extremities, or angina, or the carotid artery. And it turned out, through numerous tests, they checked blood vessels, did CT scans, took various blood samples, and even verified whether people were actually getting these catechins or not through urine analysis to confirm whether they were being absorbed. Well, the chocolate for the study was provided by a well-known American chocolate company. So the researchers followed these people who were eating chocolate regularly for about 4 years. In 4 years, if there were any effect from it, they definitely would have found and identified it. But as it turned out, chocolate had no effect on the cardiovascular system whatsoever. Heart attacks didn't decrease, strokes didn't decrease, diabetes risk didn't go down, death risk didn't change, need for stents didn't change. Nothing changed over those 4 years. So here's the important takeaway. Since the study included both healthy people and people with existing conditions, it became clear that if you have a disease, you probably need to treat it. You need to address inflammation in your blood vessels with medication. And in extreme cases, you might need to be hospitalized. But if you don't have any condition, chocolate doesn't provide any additional benefit beyond the taste experience, unfortunately. And if this study had shown positive results and proved that chocolate is beneficial, the manufacturer would have been the first to plaster it all over their marketing materials, journals, and the internet. But since no positive effect was found, the chocolate maker was disappointed, and as you can see, this study went largely unnoticed without any commentary. It turns out that chocolate doesn't bring anything but positive emotions. But hey, positive emotions are good too. By the way, there was one important observation. Cardiovascular mortality among people who ate chocolate was slightly lower, but unfortunately, it wasn't statistically significant, so they'll probably need to verify this further. But there's still hope for rehabilitating chocolate. As for the vitamin groups, it turned out there was a positive effect from them. Previously, vitamins were studied individually. One vitamin with these properties, another vitamin with those properties. But in this study, the second part was called CocoMind, and they studied a multivitamin complex specifically, meaning a complex that contains vitamins and minerals all together. And indeed, it does improve cognitive functions. Memory improves, attention improves, it's easier to concentrate, easier to read, easier to remember words. And here's the interesting difference. The worse the initial situation was, the greater the positive effect. People who already had cognitive impairment after a stroke showed the maximum effect, while healthy people showed minimal improvement. There was even a separate study that specifically looked at doctors. And it turned out that multivitamin complexes had no effect on doctors. Well, not on the doctors themselves, but on their mental abilities, which is pretty funny on one hand and interesting on the other. So for doctors, multivitamins appear to be useless, but for everyone else, they do improve memory somewhat. But chocolate isn't the only forbidden product. There's also coffee, whose history began, as legend has it, with a goat herd named Kaldi, who was herding goats near a coffee tree in the Ethiopian highlands. He ate some berries and couldn't sleep, and the goats ate the berries too and became energetic and stopped sleeping at night. And when we think about ourselves, many of us really do need that coffee in the morning to start working, or even just to wake up, or even in the evening. We know that coffee stimulates the nervous system. Well, the half of the nervous system called the sympathetic system, which makes us move more and be more active. And coffee can cause some increased heart rate and slightly raise blood pressure, but only in certain people. Not everyone. Only in those who aren't used to it. So there's a difference between people who drink coffee regularly versus people who only drink it occasionally. Regular coffee drinkers no longer experience such a strong stimulating effect from coffee, but those who only drink coffee occasionally while sitting at home or somewhere in a cafe definitely experience a more pronounced stimulating effect. But here's what's even more interesting. Coffee amplifies the cardiovascular system's response to stress. So if a person is nervous, depending on whether they're a casual coffee drinker or a regular one, the cardiovascular response will be different. For example, a casual coffee drinker who only drinks occasionally, when they get nervous, the coffee causes stimulation and actually increases heart rate and stress. But for those who drink coffee constantly on a regular basis, it's exactly the opposite. Stress is handled much more easily and without increased blood pressure, which can even prevent a hypertensive crisis. Pretty fascinating. What's interesting is that caffeine itself doesn't seem to have any effect. The caffeine itself doesn't really stimulate anything, but other compounds called tannins, which are found in coffee, are what provide this interesting effect. So it doesn't matter whether you drink caffeinated or decaf coffee, you'll still get all the beneficial properties. And here's what's really interesting. Coffee is inversely proportional to the risk of heart failure. You know, those situations where the heart has less power and doesn't handle its workload as well. Drink one coffee, two coffees, and the risk of heart failure keeps getting lower and lower. 3 coffees, even lower risk of heart failure. And the latest research showed that 4 cups of coffee per day, we're talking regular espresso diluted with water or milk or whatever, provides maximum reduction in heart failure risk. Similar studies have been done on liver fibrosis, by the way, and it turns out that the more coffee you drink, the less chance you have of developing fibrosis or cirrhosis of the liver. How about that? Plus, there was a large study with 45,000 participants. This was the NIH AARP Diet and Health Study conducted right here in the United States. They followed people who drank coffee and had various chronic conditions for 10 years, and it turned out that coffee doesn't make things worse. In many people, it actually improves their health situation. For example, drinking 4 cups of coffee per day was associated with lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Another large study from the National Institutes of Health showed that the more coffee you drink, the lower your mortality rate. People who drink 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day have lower death rates from heart and respiratory diseases, fewer strokes, less diabetes, and fewer infections. Unfortunately, regarding these diseases, the amount of cancer doesn't decrease because you still need to treat disease to prevent cancer. But for one type of cancer, coffee is definitely very beneficial. That's skin cancer or melanoma. People in hot climates tend to drink more coffee, and many of them have a lower risk of developing skin cancer or melanoma. So there you have it. So let's draw some conclusions here. Chocolate is certainly a joy, that's for sure, for the cardiovascular system too. And if you consume it in its dark, bitter form, ideally, of course, you'd use actual cocoa beans. There are supplements with epicatechin, but their effectiveness is questionable because in supplement form, you need lots of stabilizers to preserve it. In actual food products, it's preserved better. And in cocoa beans, it's preserved best of all. But in chocolate, it depends on the recipe, how much sugar they added, how much fat, and how long they roasted those cocoa beans. As for coffee, it's definitely beneficial, especially if you drink it regularly, and especially if you drink 3, 4, 5 cups a day. Then it actually provides protective properties for your body. All right, folks, that's all for today's deep dive into the science of chocolate and coffee. Stay healthy, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.